Okay, yeah, Anna Franco, if you'd like to just introduce yourself, be happy to hear more about what you do.
Sure. Give me a sec. I'm going to. Yeah. Hi. How are you?
Good.
Okay. So I work at a software company in Colombia, and I've been working a little with Hyperledger areas and
Okay.
doing some developments. And I'm interested on what you're doing with the climate accounting, and we have a
Okay.
client that has an utility and we would like I would like to know a little more about what you're doing, so maybe we can create a proposal for our client doing kind of the same thing you're doing.
Okay, great. And
I would love to be on your here with you today.
Okay, great. Great. And are you using Hyperledger? You work with Aries or Fabric yourself?
I have been working with both.
Okay.
Both with Aries and Fabric.
Okay.
Using Golang and Node.js and the Akapai and the Go agent.
Wow. Okay, great. And so, yeah, just a little bit of background of what we are working, what we do is I'll send you a couple of links. So
Sure.
one is what I'm showing you is this project to calculate emissions from basically the supply chain, but any emissions factors that are available. And I'm going to show you a quick demo of that. So I just posted a link to it. And also today, Bertrand Aretsky and we've been working on this methane project. So this is a very specific project using this platform to calculate emissions from methane in oil and gas production. And so this is a pretty technical call. We're going to talk about some programming issues and sometimes help each other fix bugs. But if you have more general questions, you're welcome to just email the Climate SIG mailing list. I'd be happy to explain to you what we're doing there as well.
Oh, okay. Okay,
so,
thank you very much.
Sure. And then I know there's a couple other people, Jonathan and Luisa, if you want to make a quick introduction for yourselves as well.
They come with me.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so you're part of the same group. Yeah, so definitely. Go ahead, Sherwood.
So yeah, Anna, how are you doing? I'd love to hear. I just kind of got up late to the call, and I would love to hear just where you're a little bit more like about the intro you gave, that your work and where you guys are coming from.
Oh yeah, we are a team from a development company in Colombia, and we have been seeing what you have been doing, following all the things with the accounting from the mining and the open climate. And we work with a client that has an utility, and it has these hydroelectric power plants, and we buy certificates from IREC to be able to sell them. And what I would like to propose to my client is start using this verifiable credentials technology to do accounting and generate the certificates with all the confidence chain, and maybe integrate ourselves with the open climate too. And I wanted to know a little more about what you're doing, and that's why we came today here. So maybe, yeah, to know a little more.
Yes, thank you. And how did you originally learn about us?
Oh, I went to it was virtual, but I was on the Hyperledger Global Forum last year,
Okay.
And I listened to to Martin's conference, and I think you were there too, right?
Yeah, yeah, I wasn't there, but I was listening.
Yeah, so since then I have been following your conference. Last time I saw the one you did with where you have the video of the COP26. And yeah, I think it's really cool. And yeah, I'd like to add to it and maybe be able to do something with our client too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for, again, telling us about yourself and your work. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have more generally on the mailing list. So
okay.
I guess at this point, Bertrand, you have been having some issues. Have they been resolved? Is it up and running successfully for you?
All right, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so I mean, I've got the working on the front end, the user interface. I mean, I got it running. It seems to be synced with the API server, the Postgres, but there were issues I posted on the Discord when I was trying to load the form pages, and it was giving me some render issue. I didn't dig into that any more than I mentioned on the chat. I just got back into working on the contracts and the tracker side, and then I figured I'd talk to you and see if there was a similar issue on your side, or if it might be something on my implementation. I'm not really sure why it would be giving me that render error. I don't know. And did anything on your side, or?
I ran through everything this morning and it seems to work for me.
Yeah.
So, and I made a video.
Well,
I posted it on the same Discord. So,
okay, I haven't checked.
Oh, by the way, here I'll post a video to everybody of what this might be a little different than what Anna was talking about, but you can take a look at this video. Where is the chat? Here it is, of what it looks like now. So it's able to, it shows emissions audits being generated for a set of activities like flights and shipments and emissions audit requests. So, and it was working for me. So I showed all the things that had to be installed, which is, there's still quite a few in different directories. So I'm wondering if there's one thing that you're missing, or.
Yeah. So when you run the API server, it's supposed to set up this Postgres database, right? The blockchain carbon accounting.
You have to create that yourself. You have to do a create.
Okay, I think that's the issue, because I had done it before and then it reset it. So I'll go through that again. I get the point. I get the issue. Yeah, so that's the database that's set up in that the root shared data folder, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think if you didn't do that, then that may be what is causing it to fail.
Sorry, I've just been familiarizing myself all these new steps for the Postgres integration, and I got a little jumbled up. So yeah, I think that should solve it. I'll get around to it later rather than trying now.
Okay.
But so we can, I don't know, because it's a minor issue, right? It's just the sort of rendering problem.
Yeah, I'm sure we can fix it together. Yeah. But I think more importantly, it's to talk through the projects, the Methane Project, and what the steps are. So from last meeting, which was on the 15th, I think, right, we had discussed the use case some more, and this is for everybody's background. I'll post a link here. So I think we made some progress. Okay, so I'm just looking at this document where we are now, and I'll show you some of the screens from our application just to think about how we can structure this into a working kind of prototype. Okay, but so right now, I think what you're coming up to is the backend NFT. Okay, so the methane emissions and the flaring emissions are this much, and the oil production is this much, right? So the total production in million tons in oil equivalents. Okay, this is the total emissions, and this is the total carbon intensity. Okay, so what you're
just for clarity, so this is giving the carbon intensity a percentage of emissions, whereas I believe we've agreed to use it as a unit of product.
Yes.
So emissions per ton of oil. This was an exercise.
Right. So the calculation we did is this. So the NF total would be this number here plus this number here divided by the total tons of output. So this is actually not MT CO2 equivalent. This is actually MT oil.
Yeah, I think if you go up to the original table, so this was an exercise I was running through in the comments, but if you go up to the original table, the unit should be correct there. Yeah, so if we look at the bucket, so these are the correct numbers in ton of oil equivalent.
So it should be 8446 and not
the problem, no, so the issue here is I was creating an example where I had converted the energy produced into its emissions. But that's not how we're going to set up the system. We don't want to track emissions divided by the emissions in the fuel produced.
Right. We want to track it by
fuel, but so that we can disregard this. And I had a discussion on what the implications of that are if you were to use that approach, but that's another topic. Let's not get into that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So then it's
this is the calculation. Yeah.
Okay, 455 kilograms of CO2 equivalent to tons of oil equivalent, right? So each ton of oil will transmit 455 kilograms.
Yeah.
Right. So so this CNFT would be issued for the backend oil producer with this number, right? So if a utility bought 1 million tons oil equivalent of natural gas from the backend oil producer, it will get 455 kilograms CO2 equivalent times 1 million, or basically 500,000, 455,000 million tons of CO2 equivalent, right? So the next question is, what to do with the CNFT? Can we transfer the CNFT? Has the fuel? So the CNFT is really both. Okay, so the CNFT is really both the carbon emissions and also the
fuel produced.
Fuel. So this is actually a token of fuel transfer, right? So okay.
So right now, what the CNFT is, as you've described so far, it's just a contract that holds all of the emission tokens and a contract that holds all of the fuel tokens associated with that oil field.
Right. So as you track, great. I hope this is not for me outside. Okay. So basically, the CNFT is actually a token of fuel being traded. It's not just a contract of the emissions being traded, right?
Yeah. So we talked about this, right? So you have the CNFTs issued. The oil, say the oil field now owns this CNFT, and there are fuel tokens within that CNFT. Now, if it trades those fuel tokens to someone else, right? Takes that CNFT and says, okay, consumer is buying my fuel. There are these emissions from flaring and methane associated with that fuel. Then we were talking about how those emission tokens are handled. What you are suggesting is that they should be transferred to whoever receives that fuel token.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Right. So there's an explicit transfer of those embedded emissions from flaring and methane venting. So I've been working precisely on that problem, which was you build this CNFT, which basically provides a reference data point for this unit amount of emissions per product produced, fuel produced. And then, when someone's trading against that CNFT, they're receiving those associated emissions that's defined by that emission, that embedded emission factor.
Okay.
So I've been making revisions to the contract so that it works like that. Essentially, once someone has the CNFT and then is trading fuel from that, whoever receives those fuel tokens receives exactly the amount of embedded waste emissions associated that are defined in that contract.
Okay, so
That makes sense. Yeah.
Does the CNFT, like, what is the amount of the CNFT? Is it going to be, for example, in a transfer of 1 million tons oil equivalent of natural gas, is it going to be 1 million CNFTs, where this 0.455, where this 455 number is a metadata point, or is it actually 0.455 CNFTs?
So an NFT is one token, right? If we think about it in that context. So there's just one of what? Well, it's not really a unit of fuel or unit of emissions. It's one token, right? With this emission factor. Okay. So you can't really trade that one token. And if we think of it in this context, we could say, okay, it's not really a tradable token, but it's a, what do you call it? Like an escrow where all of these tokens live. And then some of those the actual emission and fuel tokens can then be traded to different parties. And basically all this contract tells you is, if I buy this fuel, right, what are the percentage, or the not the percentage, but the part of the emission tokens that I also have to take responsibility for, right? These embedded emissions.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can think of it like that. So you're not actually trading in this context. You're not, if you're buying just some of the fuel from that producer, you're not buying the NFT itself. You're just using the NFT as a reference point, right? As a data point, that as basically an escrow that tells you, okay, I now own part of these emissions that were registered within that NFT. Does that make any sense?
So the NFT is really like an emissions factor. Like, for example,
exactly. It becomes, you're right. Yeah. An emission factor that tells you how many emissions you would take responsibility for,
Like, for example, in our database, we have all these emissions factors from the UK government publications, right? That says, butane's emission factor is like CO2 equivalent, like 1.74 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per liter. And then this other fuel, which is, what is this thing called? Liquefied natural gas, has an emissions factor of 115. So you're saying this then becomes essentially an additional emissions factor.
Yes, it's an emissions factor that's unique to, in this example, that producer, and within that a time frame, right, for that producer, for the products, right? Because emission factors can sort of be general and applied to any, like it might just be a unit of fuel. It doesn't matter where that fuel came from. In this case, it's a very specific emission factor.
Okay, right. Okay. So NFT cannot be divided. That's true. It's not fungible, and each token is different, but it can be traded. Generally, that's the idea.
Yes.
Right?
So you could trade this NFT, but in a different context, right? And we need to think a little bit about what that would look like. But let's say, for example, I'm an oil producer. I'm the Bakken oil producer in the Bakken. This NFT is issued to me that certifies the waste emissions in my production. Let's say it's really low, right? The total waste emissions per unit of oil produced against some reference, like a global reference. I could then say, all right, I'm going to sell this entire NFT to someone else, say an oil distributor, and they have the equivalent amount of oil, whatever that is packaged in that NFT. So they're saying, okay, I want to trade my oil using your waste emission certificate. right? Because my consumer values that. In this case, they're just buying the entire NFT, right? And then they can, whenever they sell their physical oil, right, they can also trade against the NFT emission factor, right? They could sell it against that emission factor. So you could do it in that context.
You can create a lot of different things like that, but I think then that is going to be a data point is what you're creating here.
Yeah.
This is really like a data point, like you're publishing your own version of this database of the UK emissions factors. Like here they've got the government of England, they've got the crown here, and then you've got your right. So
yeah, true.
You're basically using this token as a data point. So you're actually storing data on the ledger, and then you're referencing that data to look up emissions and calculate emissions from. So I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing, because that's like, we did the most intuitive thing. Well, we did after trying a less intuitive thing and not working, but we basically calculated the emissions based on these emissions factors. So, oh, Sherwood has a question. Please go ahead, Sherwood.
Yes, I'm curious how, so part of the kind of interesting thing about the CNFTs is, or this kind of work in general, is being able to have embodied carbon emissions that you can track through a particular supply chain, so that the different stakeholders can kind of look and understand where the high carbon emission points of the supply chain are, how they can, develop, different mechanisms through which, they can bring investment to those pain points, so they can kind of lower their overall carbon emissions. And I'm just kind of curious how you can accomplish that, or if there are any issues with accomplishing that. Because with that, I kind of, like, my brain right now and my understanding is kind of seeing this kind of like, this CNFT that kind of follows this particular variable all the way through the process. You can kind of, at different stages, kind of understand kind of the flow of embedded carbon emissions through the value chain. Selling that token to another, producer on the other side of the world in a totally different value chain, seems like you'd kind of be pulling that emissions out of the system somehow. And so I was wondering if I'm misunderstanding, or that can be resolved, or the information is still there, that, they still know where the carbon emission stuff are. They're just basically accounting for it in different ways. And like, am I making sense? Does that make sense? What I'm kind of describing?
I think I'm seeing the same issue, which is you can't actually transfer the CNFT to somebody else. That's your audited emission, or that's a result of your emissions audit. That's what you can say is, my CNFT is lower than the industry average. So for each unit that you've bought, you can get a reduction. So I'm thinking, I guess if you want to go this route, what you could do is just basically, you could publish your CNFT into a database, right? Like, kind of like this. You could have your own database, and it lists all the different sources, like Bakken and Permian, and then eventually like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, and then what their emissions profile is, right? So that when there's transactions that happen, I guess somebody like me could then download that information into a database from your database. So you're, you know what I mean? You're kind of, forget the word database, but you have data points, which somebody else could use then to calculate their emissions, right? Like, it's actually not a token that you're transferring, right?
Yeah, you can think of it like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, Yeah, I mean, if you think of it as a certificate, it's not really a certificate in the way it's being used right now. It's just,
Right.
yeah,
But you can issue
providing
certificates based on it. You can issue all
based
sorts of.
on it.
I mean, it's more like
Yeah.
a credit, right? It's like instead of coming it from the top of the renewable energy credit, it's kind of like a production credit
Yes.
of emissions going the opposite direction, which what kind of plugs better into this kind of like a marketplace. But I'm just kind of going back to do I understand, I guess my question is, if an organization, let's say an oil manufacturer isn't doing anything about their kind of carbon emissions, and they have high gas flaring, and so they have high embodied carbon emissions in their 1,000 barrels of oil. They essentially like transfer that higher emissions token to another low emitting competitor through whatever kind of value exchange that they have. Does that mean that moving forward, that barrel of oil, that 1,000 barrels of oil that is high carbon emission, is then treated as if it in their supply chain as if it isn't high carbon emissions? Yeah, because essentially they're taking on the lower carbon emissions. They've kind of gotten rid of it. And so all that carbon that's been emitted has been transferred to another organization. And so their supply chain, their emissions have kind of a lower emissions. And everybody who sees, so I guess that's my question. Like, if you're looking at it from a supply chain emitting standpoint, they're not seeing that 1,000 barrels of oil as kind of a high emissions pain point anymore in that supply chain, because that's just taken out of the supply chain measurement because it's been transferred to another. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, it's like a renewable energy credit. Like, basically somebody could buy the lower emissions certificate, pay a premium for it, and then I think Bertrand told us about the methane performance certificates, right? That's supposed to be how it works, right?
Okay, right.
Sorry, I actually, Bertrand, you would know this. What do you think?
Yeah, so the idea of methane performance certification, yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around everything that you guys are saying, because I understand your point, Sherwood, of whether this is actually a tradable thing or not, and if it is traded, what does that mean? Sorry. Just thinking. So where do we stand right now? So this, if we were to use this as a methane performance certificate, basically this would tell a buyer, what's the percentage of methane emissions per unit of gas that they're buying, right? So they would know when they buy that unit of gas exactly what the methane emissions were realized, right? So that's essentially how it could be used, right? As an MPC, as a methane performance certificate, a data point, right, for that certificate. And then basically any fuel bought from that certificate, right? Any of these fuel tokens purchased from that certificate tell you that, yeah, we have certified that this gas did not emit more than, say, 0.1% of the methane produced to the atmosphere. That's what an MPC would tell you. So that's how I envision it being used. It's a unique data point, and that it's unique to a specific unit of fuel that someone has bought. Now, the idea that I was bringing up, whether you could actually trade these data points as a certificate, it's I acquire some natural gas and I pay a producer for their certificate so I can sell my gas, right, under that pretense, that methane performance certificate authentication. And the reason why it depends on the context, right? But say you have a natural gas pipeline system, and it has a whole bunch of gas that's been fed into that. You don't actually know the molecule of gas that you're selling, right? It could come from a variety of sources, but you care about selling that Bakken gas, or say whatever the supplier is of that gas with a low emissions to your consumer. So you want to buy that certificate. In this case, you want to buy that, what I was calling this carbon tracker NFT, because now it gives you the right to sell fuel, whatever physical commodity you're selling, right, with that emission tag on it. So it doesn't mean that you're removing emissions from the supply chain. It just means you're assigning to a particular stakeholder in the supply chain. They're taking ownership of that because they've paid for it, right?
No, I see that. It's actually an NFT in the real sense of like these NFTs that are a title to like a music or something, or you know what I mean? Like when you buy an NFT, you actually own a quote unquote own a song or a fraction of a song. So in
this case, right, that NFT sort of becomes non-tradable once it's been depleted, right? Once all the fuel has been sold from it, it's not tradable in the sense that right, I can buy fuel from that NFT with a certified, because let's say all of the fuel has been sold to consumers in the marketplace. Now, someone could buy the NFT just as a badge of saying, all right, I'm supporting projects that have produced in the past fuel below a certain threshold.
Right.
It's sort of not a novelty thing, but like a badge. So that's one way I've looked at it. But the real value for me, for why people would trade this, is like, you know, so he was saying, I purchased ownership in this certificate, the certificate, and I can then sell fuel, right, based on what's available in that certificate, right? So that this NFT tells you multiple things. It tells you the emissions available, or the emissions realized, and the sort of the tally of fuel that can be traded from that certificate.
Yeah, I mean, this NFT could be like not something that the producer sells, but the certifiers like us, we could sell this NFT to people in return for our services to certify the natural gas. We could say you could buy this NFT and then reuse it. I mean, you can lock up the contract that way.
Yes. And the difference between this and the emission factors and the databases you were showing, is that this is tied to, you know, a quantity of fuel. It's not just right, a standalone factor that you could apply to anything, right? It has constraints on it. And basically all the NFT is doing is it's telling you what those constraints are, the total emissions and the total product.
Okay. So Sherwood has another question, and I want to show you generally where our UI is, and let's discuss how we can fit this all in together. Go ahead, Sherwood, please.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if it's possible, since all this information is kind of on a blockchain and it's just a matter of kind of querying and kind of organizing information, but say we're working with a group of stakeholders in the oil and natural gas industry. They're trying to understand kind of the emissions, historical emissions across their supply chain. And essentially, I kind of see two profiles, right? There's a profile for the product that is the emissions profile, at the end emissions profile of that product that is diminished through RECs or the CNFTs. But there's also, is there a way to kind of have a profile of all the information streaming through the supply chain over time, so they can kind of develop profiles for the emissions activity of the supply chain as a whole, of all this information, kind of get the big picture to see, you know, how the emissions activity that's occurring, and almost kind of like there's like two profiles, right? There's like the actual emissions of their supply chain, and then there's the emissions of the end result after they've brought in the NFTs, the external things that they haven't really changed the emissions profile of the work that they're doing, but they've purchased it through the actions of others. And I'm wondering if with this particular approach, do you think it would be possible to kind of have both, where you're actually kind of capturing the actual emissions through the supply chain, or would that information be out there?
So you said both, so you're talking about two sort of streams of information, the total emissions in the supply chain, correct?
Yes.
And what would be the other one? Just so I
So
understand.
the two, like, so it's the actual embodied emissions of a product that has gone through the supply chain and where it came from, versus the market-based emissions, which includes the amount of emissions that's been taken out by renewable energy credits, and also the CNFT kind of the marketplace that you're describing, right?
Yeah.
Because essentially they're two end users, right? One end user is the marketplace, the end buyer. The other end users are the actual stakeholders who are trying to look at the long-term solutions for how they can kind of crack down on the high emissions points within the supply chain, because that's where you can also potentially attract investment dollars, because they can say, oh, here's the data on the actual emissions.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah, so there are two elements here, right? So if you think of it in the context of these CNFTs, essentially, if you have a trail of these CNFTs, it answers your first question, right? It provides this sort of track of information, right, of where the emissions happened and what are the emissions per product, right? Which is still very difficult to do. We're trying to provide a part, maybe even just a partial solution to get clarity on that, right?
Right.
Now, what that provides you is it can be used, right, for access to actual certificate marketplaces, whether it's carbon, RECs or offsets, and pinpointing where in the supply chain those would be most valuable, right? So where are you really having a significant impact to bring down the footprint of the final product? So the one way you can think about this is a CNFT can actually be, or you can actually take an REC or an offset credit and package it within a CNFT to say, listen, okay, we've brought down the total emissions for this specific step in the supply chain, and that cascades through to the final product. So that's the way it's sort of built out, right?
So your answer is yes. Like, ultimately, this information flow, you would be able to develop, kind of track the information for both uses.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the idea, right? You could, so if a specific facility or consumer is looking to offset its emissions, right, in this offset market, right, we were talking about the traditional, sort of credit market. Yes. It could use the system for that. Alternatively, someone could just use it for, supply chain transparency.
Got it.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyways,
Okay, let me show you quickly from my recording this morning. Okay, getting everything up and running. Can you see this video?
Yeah.
On my screen now? Okay, great. So I have posted the link to the whole video. It's on YouTube, but I want to show you. Okay, so this is all the setup. Loading all the files, loading the emission factors, loading the wallets. So here's what it looks like. Okay, so I fixed a bug there, or not. Okay, so each wallet can be associated with name and organization. So what this means is it's stored within the database that's running this app. It's not stored on, none of this is stored on chain. Mm-hmm. But we have, and this was all loaded by test. So the DApp actually allows you to reference these different people by name. So if you want to do this, you can look up somebody and you can get their public key information for like encrypting data to them. So this is one thing, okay, that you could do. And then the tokens, you can add more roles to them, like here. You can add a role to them. This is for the
quick
contract
question,
owner.
Steve.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So you have the public key name. So that's a file that's stored in the database, demo1
Yeah.
public.dem.
It's just stored like this. So there's the public key and the public key name. So
Okay,
demo
so
one,
what's the
public
difference
one.
between this public key and the address?
This is a public key for RSA public key. So this is for decrypting and encrypting
Okay,
files.
so it has all of this information, the name, all of that embedded in it.
No, it's just
No?
a public key for decrypting and encrypting. I'm not sure if it has all that information, but it has. So far, I just use it to decrypt files. So for example, there's a little, let me show you at the end. Okay, so there's an example here
Yeah.
to IPFS. Okay, so here's an IPFS file. Okay, so you go in here and you do, one sec, you do this. So you run this app. Right now it's in the command line. Okay, and it gives you an error because I missed a parameter. But you say you fetch this file from IPFS, it'll fetch it and it'll use a private key to decrypt this. So the idea is that a document, like for example, some kind of internal document or data set or a travel record or something that's used to calculate the emissions, is stored and then encrypted in the key of the auditor.
Okay.
So that this is not available to everybody to see all your data, but the auditor can, I guess, run this command or somehow use this to use that public-private key pair to get the data to verify your data, and then to issue a token for you.
And this key pair is different from the one that exists in the network, the Ethereum network.
Correct.
So,
you see there's a command here called generate key pair.
Yeah.
So this will generate a key pair in the directory. So
this is sort of an off-chain key that is owned by the user to encrypt and decrypt some information.
yes, it's not using your MetaMask to encrypt or decrypt.
I understand. Yeah. Okay.
I think this is more secure, though I'm not the expert on this kind of encryption stuff, because the key is much longer and it's the RSA security key, right?
Okay. All right.
So like,
yeah.
So the other thing is, okay, so coming back to it a little bit. Yeah, so there was a command here, okay, where you run the command, take a file, and then it'll create a queue of emissions requests. So these get stored in the database. And then you see like all this, I wonder if this should be stored as, this probably should be stored as an H store rather than these character strings. Seem to be inconsistent right now in doing this, but this is all the information, and then the corresponding documents are shown. Okay, let's just say
these are the query, the sort of attributes for the queue before the token is
for the
issued.
queue, and these are all the fields. So what happens is it's already calculated these, and then when you go and then there's a UI. Okay, and then this command process requests, it'll assign these queued requests to auditors. So this one, that 293 BC is one, and 2C 6865 is the other auditor.
So an auditor is selecting one of these queues and processing it, basically submitting it to the network.
The program randomly assigns it to an auditor.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to do it. Otherwise, you have the auditor.
Okay, so the auditor receives this request randomly and then signs it.
And then the auditor gets this UI where, okay, so here, like the auditor connects he goes to issue token.
Okay, so these pending are the, yeah, these are the requests that submitted and they have to, okay, this is where they
Yes.
issue the signature. Okay,
Yeah,
interesting.
and then, yes, and this is where they issue the token. So this is like a pending request looks like this. And then it has a, and then it has a data point of the public key, the location, and the SHA, right, of the key. So you can validate this document against this through what I just showed you, like getting the getting the public, getting the private key to, and this IPSF address, and then you're getting this document and you're decrypting it, and you can use the SHA key to validate it. So then you click on issue. Go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, this public key, the SH256 public private key here is essentially used to validate the queued information.
Yeah, it's just to encrypt and decrypt.
The queued information, the information before it's registered
Exactly.
to the network. Okay, I understand now why. So because this may be sensitive information, so you want to make sure that it's.
Yeah, before and after in the network.
Yeah.
Because it'll be permanently stored with that encryption of that public key. So
in the Postgres, in
the IPFS at IPFS.
Or okay. Yeah, at this point you're just using Postgres, right? Oh,
No,
I see.
so
Okay,
here's what happens
okay.
actually. Here's what happens is when you queue these, okay,
Yeah.
so when you queue these, they're only in Postgres.
Yeah.
So there was this command to queue.
Mm-hmm.
The queue command, so at this point, they're only stored in Postgres, and they may or may not be encrypted in Postgres. That's up to you. We're not doing that right now, but you can easily encrypt stuff in Postgres. Yeah. So when this process queue happens, it randomly selects the auditor, and then it uses that auditor's public key to encrypt and store it as a encrypted document on IPFS. So then it's left sort of the node operator to the Postgres, who has everything running on their own database, in our case, Postgres, and it's put it on IPFS where the auditor, a remote entity, can access it without actually accessing the node operator's server to get a file, et cetera.
So the auditor is accessing this IPFS data point to issue
yes.
the token.
Yes,
understand.
exactly.
Yeah, that's basically the data. That's the data registry that backs where this token came from. It's sort of the
exactly.
The manifest, so to speak.
At this point, when the auditor is getting the document back, it is coming out of IPFS.
Yeah, and that it has all the attributes needed to issue the token.
Yes, so you can verify. I mean, all the attributes are on the screen, I believe. You know what I mean? Like, or no, it's not. It's not, because, like, for example, the screen says, I want you to issue a token for 843 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, right? And from a flight. But this is how you get, okay, how did you come up with 843 kilograms? It's because these are the flights, and it could be, this is actually several flights.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like one, I think, to Portugal, and one to another one to Portugal. So this is actually several flights.
Understood.
And yeah, so that's, and then the issue, and then this becomes a token. So I guess let's think about how you could use this, because I'm thinking like your CNFT could be an audit request, right? To issue a CNFT token, right? So you can modify the process request to pass this on to somebody who would issue the CNFT token. And the CNFT token, I guess, what would be the unit? The unit would be like 455 kilogram. It would be what? It would be the total amount for a quantity of fuel?
Yeah, so
transacted?
the metric that I think we come up with is essentially the carbon intensity. So total emissions
Right.
in and the product out. So
Okay.
what I've been looking at is building on top of, so because we have to remember, right? The NFT is essentially its own contract, right? That has a bunch of token inputs, and actually the
Right.
CNFT will have ownership of all of the emissions and all of the fuel production once it's issued.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
They'll live inside that contract address. So what I've been thinking about is I've been working on it actually is creating a new function within the net emission token network Solidity contract that not only issues a token, but then assigns that token. So essentially transfers that token to the CNFT account.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So let's say an auditor gets the information for flared gas or say vented gas, right? They issue an audited emission, right? There's a function to issue that audit emission, right? But it's being issued directly to the CNFT contract and a new CNFT instance, right? That has the information of this flared gas. Now, at this point, the CNFT is missing one thing, and that's the total fuel production, right? So again, one can issue another token, right, which represents the fuel production. And I'm also looking right now at updating the NET contract so that you can have a token type that just represents a product, not an emission. We talked about this, remember?
Yeah, I'm thinking that at this point, that is a different contract. Why don't you just start a new contract for that? Because then you don't have to have so many different bells and features on the emissions token.
On the NET. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you mean actually just, you could.
There are many tokens. This app actually supports 4 different types of tokens. Even right now, like there's a whole contract for this governance and DAO that has like 3 different contracts. There's like a controller, a governor. So you can, because I think that would be cleaner, just to have a separate contract.
For what?
For products transferred.
For product transfers?
Yeah, for example, a transfer of fuel.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess we could create, I see your point. Yeah.
So actually, I think what is cool now is I could see it working this way. Okay, so the CNFT is an amount, okay, and it's an amount based on a certain quantity, and then each time like a CNFT is issued for every, and then it links back to the audited emissions. Okay, so you could have like many CNFTs, right? Each one linked to the same audited emissions. So you could certify the quantity for basically each transaction. You could have a separate CNFT, right? That certifies its carbon intensity based on the, does that make sense?
I'm trying to understand. So each NFT would only certify a unique set of emission tokens. You couldn't have multiple CNFT that reference the same emission token, right? You could.
So you could have.
I'm not understanding that. So yeah, sorry, just to clarify, if you could clarify.
Okay, what do you think of doing it so that, let's say in the course of a year, an oil company produces 10 million tons of oil equivalent of something, of oil. So then utility A comes in to buy 100,000 ton equivalents. And then we reference the total emissions of that year and we issue them a CNFT. And then that's the certification, because the CNFT is really the certification. It's not a data point that I originally thought it would be, but it's a certification. So every transaction can have a certification. And it's based on it could be based on pretty interesting things like when they bought it, right? Like the CNFT. So if you had the emissions intensity for say April and March and February, and they're different numbers, and then the gas utility says, I bought from you during March, then you reference the March one. Another company comes by and says, I bought in February and March, then you reference those two, and then you issue them a different CNFT. You know what I mean? So the CNFT becomes all the certifications that's attached to the, what is that thing called? The audited emissions.
Okay.
So
I see your point.
yeah, so then
oh,
I think there's a unique role for the CNFT.
So, but what you're 90, but it's so say there's 100 audited emissions, 50 go to this month, 50 go to the next month.
Yeah, so just to, yeah, like for example, this would be the January, right? Let's think in a year, right? April. Okay, just a few months of the year, right? And so the total production and the total emissions, right? So let's say it's 100, it's 75, it's 125, 150, 190, okay? And then 150 again. And then what do we have? We have 55, 45, let's say 70, 85. So then let's say, so these are your audited, so these are my audited emissions, okay, of the total production and intensity. So then let's say that utility A is the customer and it buys like the January lot, it buys 25, and the February lot, it buys like 30, right? So then we can calculate, this is 25 divided by the January lot, this guy, plus oh, well, I guess did too much, but so they are times, okay, B3 times C3. So, and then they're 18. So then we certify, so the CNFT for utility A is this much. Oh. And then utility B, let's say that they buy in April and then they buy in June, right? And they buy like 10 and they buy 15. So this becomes and then this becomes, so then the CNFT. So this is kind of cool because then you're recertifying, right? And I think, yeah, each NFT is a different NFT. You know what I mean? Like you've I'm just totally making up some numbers here, but so every CNFT could be a certification, and you can. So then, on the CNFT is also denominated in kilograms of CO2 equivalent, just like my tokens here were. Like just like. So then. Total emissions, available balance. Now why is this not showing up? Wow, okay. So 0.44 is the retire balance. This should be showing up here. But then we could say that it references which tokens, which would be these audited emissions tokens. So the metadata would reference back these audited emissions tokens. And then it would say like when the purchases were made. I mean, that could be part of your metadata, you know, or part of this data that's not publicly available, but you can reference it back to these emissions tokens. And then you can reference, I think, the total volume of purchases. This number here could be on the metadata.
Mm-hmm.
So if you will, so this CNFT would have, if it had two fields, it's like total retired balance is 14.6. The a volume metadata would be 25. What do you think? Is this good? Do you like this idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what I've been working on. I mean, I get
Okay.
the idea. But
It's very
essentially-
similar. Yeah.
Yeah, but essentially you have a CNFT issued to the auditor and then one issued to the utility. Correct, because
Yeah,
the
it's
original
issued by the
production-
auditor to the utility. So like
Yeah.
if you, this is, so the from would be the oil
Yeah.
company's wallet, right?
Yeah.
Issued from oil company. Issue to would be the utility B, and then issued by. We expanded this to have these three fields so that you could account for the supply chain. Well, this is wrong too. Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I get the point. Yeah, and then essentially you just have these emissions that are moving through from one facility, in this case utility, and the oil producer to another.
Yeah, you moved it
So-
from the oil producer to the utility, and you just issued a emissions token to the utility of the CNFT. So
Yeah,
then
yeah.
we can think about how to use that in their whole emissions audit, but that's kind of a separate question. But I think our job here is pretty good, right? Pretty well done if we can do this. So what this would require, I don't think you need to implement a separate contract for tracking the actual purchase of fuel. You can if you want to, but then you're implementing like an actual fuel transaction network.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
Well, the
you might
question
use,
is, how do you know how many emissions to transfer over, right? That's part of this, the audit
Yeah.
process, I guess. Yeah.
and this is this. So if you look at this file that we have for you, where is it? This file. So activities, shipment type. Okay, and then there's a tracking number or shipment, and then there's an address or flight. I think what you want to do is have another type. Okay, and it's a fuel it's a fuel purchase, for example. So you can modify the code that's there to add support for a fuel purchase, and then add the from, which would be the wallet ID, and the time periods and the quantity. So you can specify that as some kind of a JSON. And then the code could then look up the audited emissions of that party based on their wallet. And I would recommend querying the database, because I think it would be, I think querying the blockchain is just
Yeah.
Not necessarily best practice, but you can query this token database. Okay. So you can query the issue 2 matching the wallet of the oil company. And then you can query the time periods of the emissions audit. I think there's some metadata of the date. There is fields for this. Some of this may need to be fixed up a little bit, or we could just, but for demo purposes, that's the idea, is you would find their emissions audit, and then you would use the quantity purchased times their, okay, you would have to have their production fee data as well as their total emissions audit. So this has to be somewhere. And it could be a meta field of the audited emissions. So because there's all this metadata that's available. So you could have the total emissions. Yeah, I would say do it this way. So the utilities audited emissions would be, like, for example, issued by, this would be the auditor, okay? Issue from, just none, no value, because there is none. And then issue to, I mean, you're at the origin point, right? Yeah. Later on, you could have one, but I think right now that's too much thinking. Issue to the oil company, okay? And then the metadata is the production volume. And then you have the date range. Date from, date to. So this could be like, 2022, March 1, you know what I mean? Like a timestamp. And then, sorry, that, you know what I mean? Like March 1, 2022. Okay, it keeps wanting to change it to that. But then you have, like, on the metadata, you have the production, which could be 125, and then the token amount, the total retired, would be 70. So this, I think, expresses this. So then the CNFT's code could say, okay, I'm issuing from this, I have this date range. So then I go and look up this wallet for an emissions token, matching the date range, and then the production total I get from the metadata, this, and then I'm able to make a calculation based on the volume metadata here. And this, and then I can make that calculation.
I see your point.
Yeah, so you just have to, you can work with this and modify the emissions.js to make that calculation. So you can issue the tokens here, and then create one of these, make the calculation, and then present it as a pending issuance, like we had it in here.
Okay. I see your point. So so for the producer, for each emission type, essentially you're just issuing a token with the production metadata. So for whether it's the flaring emissions or the methane emissions, they would have the same, well, whatever. If it was for March, they would have the same time frame, the same production amount. It would just be a different amount of emissions.
Yeah, you can have, and yeah, if you want to get more specific, you can get more specific. You can have it broken out by the different.
I think it's
types.
important. Then this gets down to.
I'm not sure you need it.
Well,
but
this is maybe for a separate discussion, because you started this debate and the vote on how to attribute the global warming potential to natural gas.
Yes.
Right, for methane emissions, sorry, and this becomes something we need to talk about, and I think it's part of the ongoing discussion is, what's the GWP that we're applying when we're calculating an emission token, right? If we're just saying the total of CO2 and methane, right? We're basically implying that we've applied a GWP, or whether it's whatever global warming potential 25 or 100, but different users of the system, and I mentioned this in my comment, right, on that discussion. Different users are going to apply different discount interest rates or whatever for valuing different types of emissions. Should we give them that flexibility as far as how they use the system? So if they're looking at methane emissions and they want to apply a different global warming potential, they can, right? And they just rescale the value of that token. And I think that's an important thing to consider, rather than telling our users we've prescribed to this global warming potential and you have to use it. And all of our tokens have sometimes may get aggregated together into one, just one general token, that won't allow them to break down, right, the different tokens by a specific global warming potential that they would apply. And I think that's important, because this is a debate, right? It's an ongoing debate, and I doubt at any point in the future someone is going to agree on a single global warming potential as the value to use, right? It's a matter of perspective. So for our system to have that built in, that flexibility when people need it, I think would be useful. And this is an example where you have flaring and venting. They're two very different emissions, right? They both come from methane, but they have a significantly different impact based on your GWP perspective. So in that example, I think it makes sense here to have a token for each, because if you change from 25 to 100, right, for methane, your total emissions per unit of product, say of oil produced, can go up significantly.
Yes, very much so. Okay, so let's have the separate numbers, and then as to how or where we get to decide, I guess that's part of that discussion. So I'll join that.
And this was I had suggested my own proposal as maybe even a future vote, which is actually adding a greenhouse gas type ID to an emission token. So if it was issued for CO2, just general CO2 equivalent, or some other greenhouse gas like nitrous oxide or methane. So user of the system, if they want, could specify the GHG type. Now again, this is again another bell that you could add to the system, and it would be for a future decision. But I think in order to do what we're talking about, that may be necessary so that people can differentiate, okay, what type of gas is this? And do I value that gas differently than someone else, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, no, there's a really big question here, which is kind of fun, which is this is the difference between SaaS and Web3, right? Because SaaS is enterprise software, so each enterprise or each group of enterprises you sell to, they could have their own interpretation of things. And I've seen really with ERP and CRM, they will implement completely different processes on how to run those businesses. But with a Web3, you kind of need a community consensus, so all the members can transact with each other. It's not, you know what I mean? Like,
even if they interpret, they value or put different weights on different units, they can all interpret the units the same way.
Well, if you value things differently, like for example, okay, a common debate along these lines is, okay, in carbon offsets, right? So there's this question now of storage or removal of years. You know what I mean? Like, the original carbon offset was supposed to be permanent, but nothing is permanent, right? So there's people who want to say sell carbon offsets that store carbon for 10 years. And then there's people who say that their carbon is being stored for like 100 years or 80 years or whatever. And so then if it's like a network to transact in one kind of carbon offset, like the carbon removal people, the carbon soil people that want to do only 10 years, they could just totally transact and show you all the data in those terms and transact on that. But it's when everybody wants to be in the same market, then it doesn't make a breakdown, but it increases the complexity of the market, let's just say, right? Because then people are trading different units of stuff, and they have to change their pricing assumptions based on what the years are. And I think that you know, if this really, yeah, and this could go in that way. So somebody could say my carbon potential is calculated on 20-year versus 100-year assumptions, and then somebody else will say, okay, in that case, I'm going to value yours differently in my system. And
yeah. But
and
I think in
out.
order for us to accommodate that, and this goes into the suggestion that I put forth in the comments on that wiki, was why not just denominate emission tokens, at least for audited emissions, for example, in the weight. So we're using kilograms or metric tons of the gas itself, and not the CO2 equivalent. And then basically we can have a reference CO2 equivalent that's applied in our system, but anyone can just adjust that knowing what the gas is. And anyways,
that's an interesting idea. Let me think about that too. Okay, so, but meanwhile, here is Sherwood has a question. Go ahead, Sherwood. I know this is running on a little long. Thank you for.
Yeah, that's right. I just want to flag a couple things before we run out of time. The conversation with Vera, it looks like, Sai, you're not going to be able to attend that.
Yeah, sorry. Cannot.
That's fine. I just wanted to see, like, as far as like, and I'm sorry, I know I'm just jumping in the middle here, but I do want to make sure that we're kind of on the same page as far as like my thinking for the conversation with Vera is to just introduce ourselves and see if there's an opportunity to kind of find organizations they're working with that are trying to kind of tackle this issue of scope 3 emissions tracking, just to kind of find organizations to actually work with. Is that kind of in line with what you would like to talk about? Or is there anything specifically you want to bring up in that conversation?
For the chat with Vera?
Yeah. Like I just want to get because align on the objectives of the call and what you all would like to kind of engage with them about while we kind of have their attention.
Yeah, my question is, will they only be doing offsets, or are they going to, you know, expand into more general supply chain kind of things? Because the big problem I still see is that offsets are not counted into any company's total supply chain or total emissions footprint, right? Like, so you could buy a bunch of offsets, but that doesn't reduce your GHG protocol and your TCFD emissions profile. So you would have to go into your supply chain and reduce the emissions of people that you directly buy from, or else there would have to be some other interpretation.
I mean, I gotta think that, yes.
Sure.
Well, we will go ahead.
About this, it's not counted in total emission. Yeah.
Sorry, it's audio quality.
You're breaking up on us. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're breaking up on us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just type. I can't. Perhaps just type in your question. Perhaps just type in your observation into the chat. You have to just type it in. Sai, I'll definitely address that. I think they're focusing on scope 3, so I imagine that they'd have to be wanting to focus on the larger issue of standards across that particular challenge. And I know they're probably also responding to Gold Standard, which is actually just put out an RFP for somebody to actually help them build the system for tracking emissions, to do carbon accounting. So, but we'll get to the bottom of that. Yeah, so we'll definitely make sure that that's something that they're focused on and there's relevance in the conversation.
Yeah.
Bertrand, would you be willing to kind of give a high level overview? I can probably kind of kick things off, but provide kind of more of some of the technical overview of what we're building. Jonathan asks.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, I think give them a high level overview, tell them the specific problem we're looking at and how that might align with their ongoing activities. I think their focus is quite broad. It'll be interesting to see how things have narrowed in over the past couple weeks or months since they issued the initial call for interest, and how that fits in with the specific work we're doing on the oil and gas supply chain emissions. Right. And if there's any interest in that. So yeah, I'll go
Okay.
from a high level and then just talk a little bit about what we're working and see what kind of response we get from them.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
About your comment at Eski, I'm not sure. Like it would be interesting to see. I mean, when you do reporting in the GHG protocol, you're reporting your total emissions, right? You're not really reporting your offset. So I kind of agree with the initial comment, I think, that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, and then the risk is, as I don't understand the driver of this market. Well, I don't understand the driver of the market either. I have not been able to figure out.
Yeah.
Why buy it? I still don't understand. But
Okay.
anyway, that is what it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, I think there are disclosures for offsets purchased. It's an important question. I don't know.
Yeah, what can it be used for? I think until they can use it for something. That's
I mean,
totally other question.
If you think about concrete action, offsets are purchased and accounted for in total emission balances in regulated markets,
Yes,
like the
that's a
California
definite.
market and the EU. So
Yeah.
that's an example of why they're valued, right? The other case, I mean, it's really just like they say, it's voluntary. You're telling your consumers you bought it, and the consumers are satisfied. They're willing to buy the product because you reported it.
Yeah, and in all honesty, the reality is this market is tiny for a reason, right? And the reason is there is no driver of the market.
No. Not significant. Not significant. There's no critical mass. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder what Vera's plans are. I mean, I don't know that they'll tell you, but
well, they sell credit. They sell offset credits to regulated markets.
One comment about Vera, maybe there would not be. I think Vera, 90% of their project is forestation, so they will not be into the topic of supply chain and everything.
Mm.
Yeah, this is very new.
The offsets they issue is forest.
Well, I don't know that that's. They are very big in forestry, and they were started doing that. Yeah, I do. I don't know that it's 90%, but you're right. Most of what they do, this is a very new thing for them, and so
most credits issued are.
I think it's gold standard should be the right person to talk, because they have industrial projects, meaning they will sell to distributors or they are integrated into a supply chain. This is what I mean.
Yeah, how it's integrated, I don't know. That's the whole problem. That's the whole question.
Well, I add gold standard I'll go gold standard to the list and get a send and focus from people over there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so what's our next step, Bertrand? Because we've got 2 weeks now. I mean, I think it's doable based on what I'm seeing now to make the modifications, but I think we need to be programming.
Yeah, so I have been in programming, but I'll take what you've just suggested into consideration and work on how one could implement that using the metadata attributes to plug in production data. Okay. And then how that can be, and then using that for the CNFT issuance. I already have functions written for issuing CNFT using an existing audit emission token as an input.
Okay.
So it shouldn't be too complicated. I just need to put aside all of the more complex supply chain tracking elements, because that really complicates the issue. Yeah. And I'll just focus on this really simple problem that you outlined, building on our use case for the oil fields. Okay. Yeah, get that settled. I'll get back to you today if I have any issues getting the database running and the UI actually showing me the forms. Hopefully I'll be able to solve it this afternoon, but if not, I'll respond to you on Discord. Yeah, but I think the answer is in the comment that you posted. So. Okay. Do you want to schedule another call this week, either for Thursday or Friday? Just so that we are moving on track. Yeah. Because I think the Hyperledger, the global challenge, what is the deadline now? May. Prototype challenge.
May 10th, prototype ends. Yeah, May
Yeah.
10th. Okay, so that is 2 weeks away.
2 weeks, yeah. Okay. Well,
So-
if I can get the yeah, this simple example worked out and just issuing a really simple CNFT that shows, okay, these emissions came from, you know, this product producers tokens.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
with the example we draw it out, like you said, we don't even need a product token or a fuel token explicitly. I don't know
Yeah.
if that will work in the broader scheme of things. So the supply chain tracking, because you know you actually need to track products in a more explicit way. But for this specific prototype, for this simple prototype, yeah, that should work. So I don't see any issues with that. Let me work on it today, tomorrow, and then we'll meet. Let me just look at my calendar. We can meet on Thursday. Thursday may work better than Friday.
Okay. Want to do same time Thursday?
Same time Thursday, yeah.
Send an invite to everybody.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, good then. Thank you. Thanks for. Do you have a question, Oresky?
All good, all good.
Okay, good. All right, then we'll talk to you on Thursday again.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks, guys.
bye-bye.